Somewhere in a small workshop in Pictou, Nova Scotia, a European immigrant knife maker and a Canadian government outdoorsman sat down and asked a question nobody else in the knife industry was asking. Not, how do we make this knife look tactical? Not, how do we get a Navy contract? The question was simpler. What does a knife actually need to do to survive a Canadian bush camp, a Canadian winter, and a Canadian hunter's entire working life? The answer became a design so trusted that it eventually ended up in the hands of Canadian paratroopers. It's still made by hand in that same small town, using that same philosophy. And somewhere along the way, people online started calling it the most Canadian knife in the world. The title of this video makes a much bigger claim than that, though. It says this thing beats every military knife out there. That's a serious statement for a company that never set out to build a combat knife in the first place. So that's the actual question we're chasing today. Not whether this is a good knife. Everybody already knows it's a good knife. The question is whether excellent hunting knife and better than purpose-built military steel can possibly be the same sentence. Let's find out. Before we get into testing, you need the backstory, because it explains almost everything about why this knife behaves the way it does. Rudolf Grohmann was a knife maker from the Sudetenland, trained in a part of Europe that took blade making seriously for generations. He left everything behind after the war and eventually landed in Nova Scotia in 1949. Once there, he crossed paths with a man named Dean H. Russell, a Canadian outdoorsman and government official who had a theory. Canada didn't have a knife of its own, not really. Hunters and trappers across the country were using whatever they could get their hands on, usually knives designed for completely different climates and completely different jobs. So Grohmann and Russell did something most knife companies still don't bother doing. They went out and talked to the people who were actually going to use the thing. Hunters, trappers, guides, fishermen working wet decks in freezing water. They took notes on what kept failing, what kept slipping out of cold hands, what kept snapping at the tip. Then they built a knife around those answers instead of around a sales pitch. In 1957, the original design belt knife was born, later known simply as the Grohmann Nupsir. It picked up more than 24 international design honors over the years, and at one point, a version of it ended up on display at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Not exactly the resume you expect from a knife that's about to get compared to combat blades. Here's where the story takes the turn that actually matters for this video. One version of that design, built with an overlap sheath instead of the standard open one, became known as the Canadian Army knife. Paratroopers nicknamed it the jump knife, and according to Grohmann's own history and multiple longtime dealers, it was issued to Canadian Armed Forces personnel starting in 1964, staying in service for something like 3 decades. Now, I'll be straight with you. I can't hand you a procurement document with a stock number on it, and I'm not going to pretend I can. What I can tell you is that this wasn't a marketing stunt bolted on after the fact. Multiple independent sources going back decades describe the same knife, the same nickname, and the same timeline. When a design sticks around in military hands for 30 years without a PR department pushing it, that tells you something the spec sheet can't. So right out of the gate, we've got a knife with a legitimate origin story and a real connection to military service. But it was never engineered as a fighting knife. It was engineered as a working knife. And that distinction is about to matter a lot. There's one more piece of the origin story worth sitting with, because it explains why this knife has stuck around this long instead of quietly disappearing the way most regional knife designs eventually do. Grohmann still hand finishes every blade in that same Nova Scotia shop, still backs them with a lifetime warranty, and the company has genuinely been passed down through generations of the same families of outdoorsmen. That's not the kind of thing a company fakes for 60-plus years. When a hunter hands his kid the same knife his own father carried, and that knife has been resharpened 100 times but never replaced, that's a harder endorsement to manufacture than any celebrity partnership or tactical rebrand. It's also exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous reputation that never shows up in a flashy thumbnail. which is part of why this knife rarely gets mentioned in the same breath as the big tactical brands, even though its resume might actually be longer than most of theirs. Let's talk about what's actually holding this thing together, because the steel tells you exactly what kind of knife you're dealing with before you even swing it. Most Grohmann outdoor blades use a German high-carbon stainless steel, commonly 41 Newton, run at a Rockwell hardness around 56 to 58. If you're not a steel nerd, here's the translation. That's roughly in the same neighborhood as a 440 series stainless, tuned for a specific job, holding a working edge for a long time in wet, cold, corrosive conditions, and being easy to bring back to life with a stone when it does dull. It's not chasing extreme edge retention numbers. It's not chasing exotic toughness numbers either. It's chasing reliability in the kind of weather that kills batteries and freezes zippers shut. Then there's the handle geometry, which is where you can tell real field research actually happened. The boat knife version of this design uses a triangular cross-section handle. Not round, not oval, triangular, specifically so that a wet, cold, gloved hand can find its orientation by feel alone and keep grip when everything else is slipping. That's not a stylistic choice. That's the kind of detail you only land on after watching a lot of people almost lose fingers on a pitching boat deck. So far, everything about this knife says built by people who actually did the job, which is exactly what you'd hope for from a company with this pedigree. But a great field knife and a knife that beats all military knives are still two very different claims, and we haven't tested either one yet. So let's put it to work. First test: general bushcraft cutting, fine slicing, notching, carving a simple trap trigger, cleaning game. This is the knife's home turf, and it shows immediately. The blade stock on the standard outdoor model runs around 1/8 of an inch with a flat or saber grind depending on the version. That's noticeably thinner than most of the overbuilt military-style blades that dominate this kind of video, and thinner stock behind a well-set edge means less resistance pushing through material. It slices like it means it. Fine detail work that turns into a wrestling match with a thick tactical blade is almost boring here, in a good way. But then we push into harder territory. Battening through seasoned hardwood, repeated chopping on standing deadfall. And here's where the thinner geometry starts asking for something back. The blade holds up fine structurally, no chipping, no rolling. The edge geometry is solid, but you feel the physics working against you. Less mass behind the edge means less momentum on each swing, which means more swings to get through the same log a thicker chopper would clear in half the strokes. Nothing broke, nothing failed. It's just working a different kind of job than it was built for, and it lets you know that with every extra swing. That's the first real crack in the beats all military knives claim, and it's worth sitting with for a second. If your test is, which knife turns a fallen tree into firewood the fastest, a knife built around slicing and precision is not going to win against 6 millimeters of dedicated chopping steel. That's not a flaw in the Grohmann. That's physics doing exactly what physics does. But it does mean the title's promise needs a serious asterisk, and we're not done finding them yet. Next, test. And this one matters more than people expect. Corrosion resistance in saltwater. Grohmann's boat knife heritage isn't an accident. A huge chunk of their early customer base was working fishermen and coastal guides, not just inland hunters, so the stainless composition was chosen with wet, salty, corrosive environments specifically in mind. We left the blade wet with salt water overnight, no wipe down, no oil, the kind of neglect that happens naturally on a real trip when you're exhausted and just want to get in the tent. The next morning, no pitting, no discoloration along the edge, nothing beyond what a quick wipe couldn't fix. A lot of the thicker military blades built around high-carbon tool steels for maximum toughness make a real trade-off here. They can rust startlingly fast if you're not disciplined about maintenance in the field. That's a fair trade for some missions. It's a real weakness for others. And it's the kind of detail that never makes it into a chopping test thumbnail, even though it might matter more to your actual survival than one dramatic swing at a log ever will. By this point in the testing, the knife has earned a pretty clear identity. This isn't the tank. It isn't the sledgehammer that shrugs off steel beams and impact tests for a YouTube thumbnail. This is closer to a surgeon, a knife built around precision, control, and doing the actual survival job well rather than surviving abuse. It was never designed to take in the first place. And that distinction is exactly where this video needs to pivot, because tough and good survival equipment are not automatically the same thing. Here's the pivot. We've established the knife is well made, well researched, and genuinely field proven. But toughness under a hammer isn't the mission most people actually have in the woods. Most survival situations aren't a demolition derby. They're about doing a lot of small, precise jobs. Cleaning game, building a trap, making kindling, first aid, food prep, reliably for days in brutal cold, without your hands giving out from fighting an oversized handle or an edge that won't come back sharp, with a stone and 10 minutes of patience. That's a different mission than survive a baseball bat test, and it's worth asking which mission actually matters more once you're the one out there. So let's test that mission directly. Fine tasks first. Feather sticking for fire prep. The thinner blade and controlled grind make this almost effortless compared to a thick chopper. You get fine, curling shavings without fighting the geometry. Skinning and field dressing simulation on a game proxy. The drop point profile and slim stock make clean, controlled cuts without the blade wanting to dive or wander. This is where the hunter's knife pedigree pays off directly. And it's not subtle. Then we hit the first real, honest negative, because a fair review needs one, and this one's legitimate. On the Army configuration specifically, the overlap sheath and a straight blade jump knife design were built for one very particular job, getting a paratrooper out of tangled shroud lines fast, one-handed, without fumbling a folding mechanism. That means the blade profile and sheath retention are optimized for speed of access over general bushcraft versatility. If you're doing extended wilderness work, you'll actually want the standard outdoor sheath and grind, not the jump knife configuration. Grab the wrong version for the wrong job, and you'll notice it. There's also the elephant in the room from the chopping test. Nobody should be reaching for this as their primary batoning or heavy chopping tool. If your plan is one knife for the entire mission, including clearing deadfall, this isn't built to be that knife, and pretending otherwise would be doing you a disservice. But here's the reassessment that actually matters. A disadvantage for a battlefield combat scenario doesn't automatically mean a disadvantage for the mission this knife was actually built around. The Canadian Armed Forces configuration wasn't chosen because someone wanted the most brutal chopper available. A hatchet or a purpose-built kukri already exists for that job, and every survival kit that carried this knife carried other tools alongside it. It was chosen because a small, reliable, easy-to-maintain blade that could clear entanglement, handle rations, and do fine field work for 30 years straight without failing was exactly what aircrew survival kits actually needed. That's a completely different design brief than one knife to survive a demolition test. And once you understand the requirement, the compromise stops looking like a weakness and starts looking like discipline. So let's push the energy back up, because we've spent enough time in the analytical weeds. Let's talk about what actually earned this knife. Its reputation over 60-plus years. Cold weather performance. This is where the most Canadian knife framing stops being a joke and starts being the entire point. We took the blade down to freezer-cold temperatures and ran the same fine-cutting and feather-sticking tests. A lot of steels get noticeably more brittle and harder to resharpen in true cold. That's a real documented behavior, not folklore. The 4110 class stainless Grohmann uses is chosen specifically for edge stability and ease of field resharpening in exactly these conditions, and it showed. No chipping, no edge rolling, and touching it back up with a small stone took under 2 minutes. That's not a flashy test. It's not going to get you a thumbnail with sparks flying. But if your actual survival scenario involves a Canadian winter instead of a studio, it might be the single most important test in this entire video. One more comparison before we get to the climax, because it's the kind of thing that only shows up after you've lived with a knife for a while, instead of just filming one test day. Maintenance. We deliberately dulled both blades the same amount, then timed how long it took to bring each back to a working edge using nothing but a basic field stone. No belt grinder, no shop tools, the way you'd actually have to do it out in the bush. The Grumman came back to a hair-shaving edge in a few easy passes. The thicker tactical steel took considerably longer and needed more aggressive angle work to get there, which tracks with everything the sharpening test earlier suggested about the underlying heat treatment philosophy. Out in a controlled setting, that difference barely registers. 3 days into a real trip with cold hands and a 5-minute window before dark, it's the difference between a sharp knife and a knife you're white-knuckling through your next task. Which brings us to the real climax. The question the whole video has been circling. Not can it survive abuse, because we already know the honest answer to that is not as well as a purpose-built chopper. May. The real question is, for the mission, this design was actually built around extended cold weather field use, fine survival tasks, reliability over decades, easy maintenance in brutal conditions. Does it actually outperform the thicker, heavier, more tactical knives people assume are automatically better because they look more aggressive? We ran side-by-side fine task testing after both blades had spent time in the cold, feather sticking, small game processing, precision notch cutting. The thinner, purpose-researched geometry consistently produced faster, cleaner results with less hand fatigue. The thicker blade wasn't bad, it just wasn't built for this particular job. The same way the Grumman wasn't built for battering through a steel beam. After all the cutting was done, we went back over the edge with a loop. No chips, no rolled sections, just even honest wear consistent with actual use. Exactly what you'd expect from a steel chosen for resharpening ease over headline toughness numbers. The tip was still true. The handle, even after cold weather gripping and repeated fine work, showed no play, no looseness, nothing you'd worry about trusting your fingers to. So where does that leave the title's promise? Does this beat all military knives? Honestly, no, not universally, and I'd be lying to you if I said otherwise. If your test is pure abuse, but toning through steel, surviving impact tests, chopping through green logs as fast as possible, a thick, purpose-built combat chopper is going to win that fight. And it should, because that's the exact job it was engineered for. But beats all military knives was always the wrong finish line to chase in the first place. The better question is which knife actually gets the mission done, and for the specific mission this design was built around: extended, reliable, fine field work in brutal Canadian conditions, maintained easily, trusted for generations. This knife doesn't just compete with military-issue blades. It arguably outperforms most of them because it was never trying to look tough. It was trying to work. Who should actually own one of these? Hunters, trappers, backcountry travelers, anyone doing serious cold weather field work where fine control and easy maintenance matter more than demolition-proof toughness. Who should look elsewhere? Anyone whose realistic scenario genuinely involves heavy batoning or combat-style abuse as the primary job. That's a different tool for a different mission, and no amount of Canadian pride changes that. And that's the Ranger rule for this one. Don't judge a knife by how much punishment it can absorb. Judge it by whether it solves the actual problem you're going to have. A knife that was quietly trusted by hunters, trappers, and paratroopers for over 60 years earned that trust by doing its job, not by surviving a highlight reel. Understand your mission first, then decide which knife actually deserves to be on your belt. Stay sharp out there. I'll see you on the next one.